Home video games were notorious for burning images onto the family television, so I drew an underground game. You had to avoid all brightly coloured backgrounds. And games are either underground, where it's black, or up in space, where it's black. I was drawing the maps on the TRS-80 screen using the basic program. I could assemble the program on the TRS-80 in the TRS-80 memory, and then squirt it into, I could fill the Spectrum memory in 2 seconds with that, and it gave a very fast workflow. I didn't even have to reload it. If the Spectrum crashed, I just restart the Spectrum, squirt it over again in 2 seconds, and it was very productive. I made a small board on Vero board. Originally, it plugged into the back of the Spectrum, and came from the parallel interface on the TRS-80, and it let me fill the memory of the Spectrum from it was one command. On Manic, you always started in the same place. There was a fixed start place for the screen. Each screen was a separate, totally discrete, separate puzzle. You had to get from the start to the end. The game I drew is quite different from the game that emerged. Yes, I think I had more plans for various other kinds of conveyors and rivers. There was definitely a lot of falling water in the original idea, but gameplay dynamic of just the jumping and the collapsing floors, that seemed to be enough to do all the puzzle and the conveyor belts. You make a drawing, and then you write the code to animate the drawings you've drawn, but the code you write is it becomes inspired by its own technical reasons for being. You hit the limits of the machine and you realise you haven't got enough memory to buffer the whole screen, so you buffer the top 2/3, and that made all the pre-existing map designs obsolete. It's seeing things move on the screen. That's when there's feedback between what you're seeing and what you're doing. I was mostly working with just the first screen doing the coding. There's 2 separate parts. There's designing the screens and writing the code, and you can't be sure, you can't really design the screens until you know what the code is going to do, even if you haven't got it there yet. The first screen was my sandbox, where I tested all the technical things, like whether the jumps are certain distances. Some of the early screens were purely technical. There's one where there's lots of very difficult jumps, and that level was drawn specifically for testing all the various nearly impossible jumps to see whether the ones I'd drawn on graph paper and worked out they should just be possible. But it had to be some way of actually physically proving that. The game needed music, as I felt it was an integral part of the attraction. The title song, I had an old simple piano arrangement and sheet music, so it was easy to transcribe. I did everything as quickly as possible, get the loop running as fast as possible. But I never got too pretty about exact timings, because I disabled all the interrupts, so there was no, I wasn't even paying attention to the sync. Because the double buffering meant that whenever the electron beam was going past, you always had either the current frame or the previous frame was always ready for display. So that took a lot of the pressure off for the time. You couldn't do that sort of thing on the Commodore 64 if you wanted smooth graphics. But or if you wanted a scrolling game or anything. That's when the timing's become critical. I was working all night for 8 weeks or so. All night and all day, really. It was just catching naps. And I think in that, the 8 weeks includes the time it took me to design and build the interface board. That was probably about a week's work. The levels on Manic are discrete, so I play tested each one individually, and I could do every one of the screens. We could see it was going to be popular because the game was mostly playable on the first level quite early on. A lot of the time is in designing all the later levels, so you could play the game. I wasn't really interested in what people were talking about it. My main concern was whether they bought their copy and whether I'd received my share of the funds. I was making a product for sale.